Here we are in week 5, and the topic of this week's reading and writing is Sir Thomas Malory and the Morte d'Arthur. Let me repeat that. The pronunciation of the work of literature that we're looking at this week is Le Morte d'Arthur, not Morte d'Arthur or Morte d'Arthur. People have trouble pronouncing it. From now on, you'll know it's the Morte d'Arthur. Sir Thomas Malory, written in the late Middle Ages. Really, this is the last medieval work we'll be looking at as we move on then to Shakespeare and Milton in the Renaissance, taking us to the end of the period, or the end of the territory that is covered in this course, English literature from the beginnings to 1700. Sir Thomas Malory was apparently a minor aristocrat who we have some scant evidence to indicate that he was imprisoned, probably on political charges. We're not sure of that, and to be imprisoned at that point as an aristocrat may not have been all that uncomfortable thing. He apparently wrote the Morte d'Arthur while in prison, and so he must have had access to manuscripts and books in French and Latin and Middle English, which we know from some of the analyses scholars have applied to this work. I have given you a rather lengthy written introduction to this this week to suggest something about how large the collection of Arthurian legends was prior to Sir Thomas Malory's writing, and how much he has boiled down into what proportionately is a really condensed version of the story of King Arthur. Really, Sir Thomas Malory is the first person to conceive the idea of writing an account of King Arthur from the beginning to the end, really like a legendary biography of King Arthur, Arthur of Camelot. The work was written in the 1470s and then published in 1485 by William Caxton. William Caxton was the first printer of English books. He first printed English books actually outside of England, but later moved his printing press to Westminster outside of London and became the most important printer of that century. Caxton's Malory, or Caxton's printing of the Morte d'Arthur from 1485, is taken by most literary scholars and cultural historians as representing the last of the medieval works of literature and the first important work of prose literature to be published in the English language. This was printed as a book and circulated in book form, and until the year 1934 was the only version of Sir Thomas Malory's work that we knew anything about. Again, look back at my introductory remarks and maybe have a look at some of the newspaper clippings on my website, and you'll see that 1934 brought a very important discovery of an unknown manuscript that was very close to what apparently was the original form that Malory wrote the story in. It's a long, complicated work. I said that it is probably the most comprehensive condensation of a vast array of material in various languages in which Arthur and various members of his court at Camelot were treated. Nonetheless, even though it's a condensation, it's extremely long. And again, you can look at the introductory statements to see just how long it is. It's a pretty long book in 2 extensive paperbacks in the Penguin translation or Penguin edition. As I said, it's the last of the medieval works. It's the first major piece of English literary prose. Its subject is chivalry, but the book was written, or I should say the story was written and the book was published long after chivalry had ceased to be a viable living tradition of contemporary life. Sir Thomas Malory is writing about a tradition that he knows has already vanished. There's a certain element of nostalgia here to the or nostalgia for the old days in which knights were honorable and ladies were beautiful, and love between knights and ladies was pure and ennobling, and so forth. Malory is writing about a dead tradition. If in the modern world people are inclined cynically to say, well, chivalry is dead, or to ask the question, is chivalry dead? This question was being asked hundreds of years ago by Sir Thomas Malory, one of the writers who makes the best representation of the idealized world of chivalric knighthood in Arthurian Camelot. A lot of the book has to do with romantic love. A lot of it has to do with battle, warfare, jousting and tournaments between chivalric knights of the later medieval period. If you read the introduction, which you'll have to do if you're going to answer the quiz questions, Eugene Vinaver's introductory remarks say that really Malory's long work falls into three segments. In the middle, there's the story of the quest for the Holy Grail, which was a rather late addition, in fact, to the overall structure of the Arthurian legend. There was the material before the quest for the Holy Grail became the main mission of Arthur's Camelot, and in this first section, or earliest part of the story, we find the account of the establishing of Arthur as the King of Camelot, the story of the pulling of the sword from the stone, the gathering around him of all the best knights at the round table of Camelot, his marriage to Guinevere, and his effort to use his court as a place where justice would be served and the oppressed would be relieved of oppression, where knights with the highest ethical and moral values would go throughout legendary England and make sure that people were free and were well treated. The problem is that this is a very idealistic view, and in the first part of the story we find almost immediately things begin to go wrong. The knights who are supposedly so noble prove to be not so noble after all. Lancelot, who is Arthur's best knight and his first knight, as Caxton's Malory prints it, also the title of a very good movie by, I've forgotten who, with Richard Gere in it as Lancelot. Lancelot proves to be, though he is the first knight and the best knight, he's not a perfect knight. And part of the story is that despite his efforts to do the right thing, he ends up accidentally, sometimes on purpose, sometimes as a result of supernatural enchantments that have been cast upon him by evil sorceresses, he does the wrong thing. Surprisingly, despite the fact that he's a failure himself in some ways, one of his offspring, maybe his only offspring, is Sir Galahad, who's presented by Malory as the most noble and the purest and most holy of all the knights of Arthur's court at Camelot. In the middle of the story, there's the quest for the Holy Grail, and it is, I'll tell you, it won't ruin it for you, to know that Sir Galahad is the one knight who is able to fulfill the quest for the Holy Grail, to actually find and take possession of the Holy Grail, only because he's the purest of all the knights. But he's so holy and so pure that, like the Holy Grail, he can no longer remain in England and is taken up into heaven shortly after the discovery of the Grail. The last part of the three-part story is the story that leads up to the cataclysmic civil war within Camelot that's fought partly because of Lancelot and Guinevere and their illicit affair, and partly because of jealousy of King Arthur's illegitimate son, Sir Mordred, who is jealous and wants to usurp the throne of Camelot and wages battle against Arthur. And in the climax of the story, at the very end, he's responsible for King Arthur's death. There's some interesting aftermath material that I'll be asking you to read, and I think some of the quiz questions require that you show you understand what's the ultimate fate of King Arthur, what's the ultimate fate, what becomes of Lancelot after this is all over and Camelot is no more, what's the fate of Guinevere, and that sort of thing. Another thing I want to say is that Camelot has been treated as sort of the epitome of the ideal realm or the ideal kingdom in English and American history. The Kennedy administration in the 1960s, John F. Kennedy and his wife Jackie were regarded as having established a kind of enchanted realm in the White House. The presidency of Kennedy was called Camelot. As we all know, unfortunately, John F. Kennedy wasn't so honorable a man himself behind the scenes. I think Jackie comes off the best as the very honorable and dutiful and beautiful wife who was able to survive and thrive despite many difficulties. Camelot wasn't so great, as it turns out. And if you're at all interested in music, and maybe older music, not all of you are, I'm sure, there's a very famous musical called Camelot, and a very important soundtrack, which you can still find on LP, if you're back into vinyl, or on CD, or in digital form. If you have a chance, do a Google search or maybe a Groove Shark search for the recording of Richard Burton singing Camelot. I think it captures the sense of this wish for an ideal realm, this nostalgia for a perfect kingdom, and then the recognition, the sad recognition that it's only a dream. It's only a dream. My last comment is that just as the first half of this course was about human excellence and human frailty, so the theme continues. In this work of literature, we find people doing some amazingly brave and selfless and heroic, chivalric things, and then we find people doing some really bad things for which they ought to be and generally are very much ashamed. Good luck reading. I hope you do well on the quizzes. Write a good essay. Follow the advice that I gave you for the midterm in your shorter essay for this lesson, and I will see you on the other side.